Hi, everyone. I'm Stephanie Contra O'Hara. I'm a licensed professional counselor, and today we're going to dive into Mama's Mental Health Matters. I'm the owner of Well Minded Counseling, and I have a podcast called Redefining Us that really dives into all of the transitions that women go throughout their life, whether it's a transition out of college, the transition into motherhood, the transition into a new career, transition into empty nesting, retirement, all of those things are what Redefining Us podcast is about. But we've been really focusing recently on the transition into motherhood, since that's the part of this Redefining Us that I've been really interested in most recently. So, this presentation goes along with that. So, common issues that arise in postpartum include the list of these things that you see on your screen here: perinatal depression, perinatal anxiety, perinatal obsessive compulsive disorder, post traumatic stress disorder, bipolar mood disorder, psychosis. Of course, everyone recognizes sleep deprivation occurs in early motherhood, pelvic floor pain, feeling overstimulated, and processing the experience of birth. I'm going to dive into what perinatal depression includes. So, oftentimes people realize that they're experiencing depression. However, there is something different about perinatal depression that makes it significant. So, there's something called baby blues that happens in the first 2 weeks after birth. Your hormones shift dramatically after birth. And it is expected to feel what they call baby blues in the first 2 weeks. However, after that, if it prolongs, lasts a month, 2 months, 6 months, a year, etc., that's what they classify as perinatal depression. And studies show that 1 out of 5 women experience perinatal depression, and even men can experience this. 1 out of 10 men may experience this during the perinatal period. However, the numbers are likely higher because people underreport and oftentimes are increased in high stress parenting groups. High stress parenting groups include people who return back to work, people who have limited resources, whether it's financial or external support, people who are in general like not able to get their needs met because of limitations of time and money and other resources. Perinatal depression includes persistent sadness, low self-esteem, sleep disturbances, anxiety, lack of interest, low self-esteem, loss of appetite, irritability, anxiety, hostility towards an infant or others, blames themselves a lot, feels a sense of humiliation, difficulty bonding with a baby, and it includes up to 1 year after birth is what's defined. I would say perinatal depression can linger, but they start classifying it as depression after the year mark. Perinatal anxiety, approximately 20% of people develop perinatal anxiety. They experience anxiety in a way where it's constant worry, feeling that something bad might happen, racing thoughts, disturbances in sleep and appetite, irritability, inability to sit. Physical symptoms include dizziness, hot flashes, sometimes diarrhea, nausea, feeling of anger, irritability and or rage, nervousness, and or on edge. So both of these things are what are widely talked about in postpartum. I would say postpartum depression gets more talked about than anxiety, but these other things also impact your postpartum experience. But I feel like, yeah, they're just like under talked about. So, perinatal obsessive compulsive disorder. This is a mental health condition that is characterized by repetitive, unwanted, intrusive, and irrational thoughts that may cause an excessive urge to perform an action. It's an estimated that 7.8% of pregnant individuals and 16.9% of individuals experience postpartum OCD, and some partners also experience this. So the non-birthing person. And I think what's really hard about OCD in postpartum is it oftentimes gets explained away as maybe just anxiety, but it's the urge to complete an action or an urge to avoid something in order to remain quote unquote safe that becomes compulsive and detrimental to the birthing person's mental health. Postpartum PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, is perceived as a real trauma during delivery or in postpartum. These traumas can include prolapsed cord, an unplanned C-section, needing to use a vacuum or forceps during delivery, a baby going to the NICU after birth, feelings of powerlessness and or lack of support, and just severe complications or injury related to pregnancy or childbirth. Approximately 3% of people who give birth experience postpartum PTSD following childbirth, and this increases to 15% in high-risk populations. So what do the symptoms look like? So flashbacks of the birth, they might have nightmares, avoidance of reminders associated with the event, persistent increased arousal, which includes difficulty sleeping, irritability, feeling hypervigilant, exaggerated startle response. They might have anxiety or panic attacks, feeling a sense of unreality and detachment, and avoidance of aftercare following a traumatic birth. I think the amount of birth traumas that exist are, again, underreported here in what I just read. I think that women tend to minimize their experience because the focus becomes on the child and less on them, both in the way that culture and medical society promote, but also I think for a woman, they tend to try to compartmentalize and focus their attention on the baby, which then exacerbates the duration as well as the intensity of not just postpartum traumatic disorder, which is what we're talking about, but all of these diagnoses or concerns. The next one I'm going to dive into is bipolar mood disorder. So research shows that 50% of women with bipolar disorder are first diagnosed in the postpartum period. There are two phases of this mental disorder, the highs and the lows. The low period is clinically called depression, and the highs are clinically called mania or hypomania. So symptoms of mania include decreased need for sleep, increase or faster speech, uncontrollable racing thoughts or quickly changing topics during speech, distractibility, increased activity, and increased risky or impulsive behavior. Symptoms of hypomania include feelings of worthlessness or guilt, fatigued, increased or decreased need for sleep, increased or decreased changes in appetite, restlessness, difficulty concentrating, and frequent thoughts of death or suicide. So as you can see, like all of these things have such significant impacts on the birthing person or the mother in a lot of cases of children. And I think, yeah, these things go underreported and undercared for. So hopefully by learning this information, you'll just be more informed and maybe more supportive of yourself or someone that you know. Want to continue talking about the diagnoses, including perinatal psychosis, another diagnosis that's so under talked about. And unfortunately, a lot of women who end up having perinatal psychosis end up in jail because they hurt their baby in some way, or they end up hospitalized because they end up hurting themselves. And yeah, I think there's a lot of shame that goes with experiencing perinatal psychosis. It could be people who have never experienced psychosis in their life have perinatal psychosis. It's a serious disorder that usually is onset in the first 2 weeks, but up to a year after birth. Approximately 1 to 2 people out of 1,000 deliveries experience this. So again, it is rare, but it has such a significant impact on the people who experience it. They can experience delusions or strange beliefs, hallucinations, feeling irritable, hyperactivity, severe depression or affect, decreased need for or an inability to sleep, feeling paranoia, rapid mood swings, and difficulty concentrating. All of these things that I've gone over so far are treatable and deserve help. So definitely encourage anyone to reach out. Um, because yeah, unfortunately, many people experience these things and it's just not one-off experiences. So issues that often come after birth for obvious reasons, sleep deprivation. Babies don't sleep well. They need to be fed frequently, even throughout the night. Most mothers get the recommendation of feeding their baby every 2 to 3 hours after birth for about the first 3 to 4 months. So that means that as a mom, you're waking up and feeding your baby frequently, or your baby is voluntarily waking up and you're having to soothe them or feed them. So many partners split this, um, but a lot of people who breastfeed find themselves doing this solo throughout the night until their baby is introduced to a bottle. There's a lot of media and information about nipple confusion. I'm not a doctor or a lactation consultant, so this is just my opinion here, but I do think like fed is best, and I'm sure a lot of people would say that too, but if you're struggling to breastfeed your baby or you just can't wake up every 2 to 3 hours because it's wrecking your mental health and your physical health, like please introduce a bottle. Your wellness as is as important as your child's wellness. Pelvic floor pain is another thing that I think gets swept under the rug, whether it's because you had a degree 4 tear or degree 2 tear or whatever, like you will have some pelvic floor discomfort. Um, Even just the healing after being pregnant, like it takes a while for your ligaments and your entire pelvic floor to gain the strength that it needs to hold you and hold women together. So I definitely recommend a really well-informed pelvic floor PT, as well as any other exercises that you can gain from learning about your pelvic floor, I think, is really important. And healing your pelvic floor after childbirth, whether you had a vaginal delivery or a C-section, is super important. Oftentimes, women that have C-sections have attempted to have a vaginal birth prior. And even if you didn't fully deliver your baby vaginally, there's still a lot of havoc that is created by trying to deliver your baby vaginally. And then the healing that comes from a C-section is also extensive. I believe most doctors say that it takes at least 6 weeks to heal from a C-section. So again, nothing to sleep on, and taking care of your pelvic floor as well as the healing process after birth is really important. Another thing that I think gets swept under the rug is the overstimulation that occurs, whether that's feeling overstimulated because of touch, whether that's being overstimulated from sound or smells. Like these senses in postpartum women or even in pregnant women are just so heightened that simple things that may not have been upsetting or triggering before could be upsetting or triggering now due to the amount of input that is occurring when a baby is born, whether they're crying or feeding or pooping or whatever. Like it's very intense for a lot of people. And so being mindful that that is a normal experience and that women slash birthing people need extra support during this time due to overstimulation is really important. The final thing here is processing the experience of birth. And oftentimes, whether or not the birth goes as planned or doesn't go as planned, there could be emotions that need to be worked through. Whether it's you expected your partner to do a certain thing during delivery, whether or not you expected the doctor to do a certain thing, your body to do a certain thing, et cetera, et cetera. Like there's a lot of emotional and mental processing that I think is really valuable to do after birth about the experience of birth. That yeah, I think that can impact your relationships, the way you feel about your body, the way you feel about yourself, your worthiness. So, super important issue to address in postpartum. Why this matters. So, the medical system oftentimes has one appointment set up for the mother 6 weeks prior or post birth, and usually you get the green light and are told to just go off. And then your doctor, of course, and you're told to just go off and, you know, live your life. However, your baby gets so many appointments in their first year of life. So it can feel really imbalanced. And so, why this work really matters to me is because there's just not enough support for women in the postpartum experience. And it's super important to understand your mental health because the more that you know about your mental health, hopefully, the more you'll feel understood, the more willing you'll be to seek out support. If you're seeking out support, you'll most likely feel better sooner, and you'll also have more compassion for yourself and potentially like other women. Um, yeah, I think knowing how other women might be experiencing postpartum could help give you a little bit more grace and empathy for people during that time. I personally think as a therapist, we should be giving people grace and compassion all of the time, but knowing how people are experiencing postpartum and their experience during birth can really help inform the way that you relate to them in their new chapter of their life. All right, sex, the part that I think gets so under talked about with pregnancy and birth, which is so interesting because people usually have attempted to have sex in order to have a baby, even if intercourse didn't lead to the birth of your baby because you did IUI or IVF or surrogacy or some other um, way in order to have a baby, like adoption. Sex is still a big role of the journey of becoming a parent in a lot of relationships and in a lot of people's lives, and it's not talked about. So there's such a big relational impact that happens in postpartum, and that can impact people's desire to have sex. It could impact their ability to communicate about their sexual needs, about their sexual health. So the relational aspect of sex is definitely impacted in pregnancy and postpartum. Physical and hormonal impact. So your body either is in the middle of creating life or just birthed life. There's a lot of physical things that are happening. Your body is changing so rapidly during this time, and your hormones are also rapidly changing during this time. So these combination of things like really can impact your desire, it can impact your comfort in your body, it could impact your libido. Something that I learned in postpartum that was not talked about is that while you're breastfeeding, you're in a post-menopausal state. So your libido is so low that you have very little desire to have sex, oftentimes. This isn't every case while you're breastfeeding. I think there's also a lot of like myths that exist, like if you breastfeed, then you can't get pregnant again. That's not true. I've seen plenty of times people who have been actively breastfeeding and also get pregnant shortly after birth. Your fertility is really high after um, postpartum. So the likelihood of getting pregnant again is pretty high. So all of these things I think need to be talked about and discussed and like really understood as it relates to sex. Some women might be really excited to get pregnant again. Some women might be like really terrified to get pregnant again and may want to prolong sex. So I think that is really important for a couple to be discussing in the postpartum time, the emotional impact. So now you're not just in a relationship with your partner, now you're in a relationship like with this baby. And now your relationship has a relationship with this baby. You're no longer a couple, you are like a family. So figuring out how to navigate that and be a family rather than a couple, I think can be complicated and has a lot of emotional impact. You, as a mother or a birthing person, typically are spending a lot of time giving to a newborn and giving to a child. So, how to figure out the balance of taking care of your own emotional needs, taking care of your baby's needs, as well as being connected to your partner. I think it's a little bit of a dance, and priorities shift and reshift and change again and again in postpartum. So I think really being aware of all of these changes and shifts can help you manage the extent of the emotional impact and hopefully inform your sexual health and your sexual relationship. Mind body connection. So, especially with women who've had postpartum PTSD, I think this mind body connection gets turned down or turned off if you've had a traumatic birth. Oftentimes, people want to disconnect from their body because they're angry at their body. Um, they feel ashamed that they weren't quote unquote able to give birth vaginally or have a healthy delivery or something. And so an easy way, quote unquote, using air quotes here, an easy way to cope with that is like turning off the mind body connection. And in order to turn that back on or heal it, therapy is often needed, or doing mind body connection practices like yoga or mindfulness walking or some sort of somatic healing, because sex can be so far removed from your mind when your connection with your physical self is turned off or dimmed because of a traumatic experience that you've had. Um, Other things can also impact the mind body connection in postpartum that then impacts sex and your desire for it, as well as your pleasure for it. There's sometimes discomfort that women have after birth, whether that's because of a tear or whether that's because of dryness, or maybe their breasts feel different because they're breastfeeding or for other reasons. And so if this if suddenly a part of your body is giving you a different sensation than it used to when it's touched or when it's being stimulated, it can throw off the mind body connection, because there might be questions like, why does it feel this way now? And wait a second, this feels different. And relearning the body after pregnancy, I think, and after birth is really important for the enjoyment of sex. So this could be an ongoing experience in postpartum that needs to continue to be addressed and assessed. And yeah, I think there's a lot that needs to continue to be explored with your postpartum body as it relates to sex and as it relates to the mind body connection that you have um, in postpartum. So, what are ways for you to reconnect with yourself and with your partner? First of all, this won't happen overnight. If you've become disconnected from your body and from your partner in postpartum, it's important to remember to go at your own pace, to focusing on managing your mental health, having open and honest communication with your partner if it feels safe. What does that look like? I think is important to explore, and being aware of what's typical. I've only shared a few things here of what is quote unquote typical in a postpartum experience, but it's definitely important to continue that conversation with your providers, whether that's a gynecologist or a pelvic floor PT or a lactation consultant or a doula or a midwife. Like, it's important to have all of these people on your team because they know their specialty really well. But unfortunately, in this system that we exist, there's not a lot of cross pollination of ideas and concepts. So I think it's important to find a team of people to work with. Sex therapists, postpartum therapists will be really well aware of the mental health aspects as well as the sexual relational aspects of your postpartum experience. So again, it's really important to get connected with providers that are knowledgeable during this time. So what's next? Connect with a community. So being a mom can be really isolating in this time because of modern society. We live so far away from other people. We may not be living close to our family. We might be in a different city. So building a community to help and support you, whether that's they just talk you through sleep training, or they're talking to you about your baby's colic, or they're coming to your house and bringing you diapers, or coming over and doing your dishes while you sleep. Like, these types of things are really important in postpartum because it definitely does take a village, and our society's not set up for that. And I talk a lot about that in my podcast, which I encourage you to listen to. But yeah, having a community is really important. I was already kind of talking about the second part, accessing resources, having a really well-informed like medical team and mental health team, I think is really important in postpartum. Um, the system's not going to naturally encourage that. It is up to you as a mom to get resources for yourself. So I really encourage you to do that in your postpartum experience. Learning about your body more. I learned so much about my own body and about women's bodies in postpartum because it really felt like a crash course. Like, okay, these are all the things that are happening. And I think if you feel prepared, you will have a better experience in postpartum. But if you're in the thick of it, I think just being compassionate with yourself and reminding yourself that there is a lot of changes that are happening in your body and just learning about them can help you feel a sense of like validation or feeling things normalize, which hopefully will help you begin to reconnect with it. And slowing down again, like motherhood and the beginning of it feels really intense and can continue to feel intense for a while. So rather than trying to feel like you have to rush through or you feel like you just have to like suck it up and walk the walk, like it could be important in this time to really slow down and reconnect with yourself and your family, and your support people, and with your body. Offerings at Well Minded Counseling. So, at Well Minded Counseling, I'm offering an 8-week prenatal and postnatal support group, as well as having a workbook and educational videos for you to watch. And we offer therapy, whether that's EMDR or DBT or CBT or ACT. And we specialize in working with women in postpartum, myself, as well as a few other practitioners. So I really encourage you to get connected with a therapist or join my group, listen to the podcast. All of these things I think could be really supportive of people during this experience in their life. And yeah, I hope you all do find resources, whether it's with us or with somebody else. This time is a very special time, not just in entering motherhood, but also figuring out who you are as a mother, figuring out who you are now as a family, figuring out who you are now as not just a wife, but a mother to your partner's child. All of those dynamics have shifted and I think need to, be talked about and explored and paid attention to as in your transition as a mother is a unique one and yeah, worthy of talking about. So I hope that you will connect with us or somebody else in the community during this time because it's so valuable for you to do and give yourself that gift of space for your healing and your journey during this time. Well, thank you all for listening and hopefully you learned something and I'd love to connect. So feel free to reach out to me. I'm Stephanie Contra O'Hara. Again, I'm the owner of Well Minded Counseling. And yeah, can't wait to hear from you.